Hello, and welcome to another episode of the STEM Confidence Podcast. This episode is inspired by a question that I got on Instagram about what to do if you have to explain a very technical topic to people who don't have any technical knowledge. I thought it was actually a great topic to talk about in the podcast since it takes more time to explain it. And I really like this podcast format because I can take my time, explain the topic thoroughly, and also provide some examples so that you understand me better. So let's dive right into some practical strategies for sort of decoding jargon and making STEM concepts more accessible. The first thing that I would advise is to avoid jargon and use comparisons. The important thing here is to find that sweet spot between technical jargon and real world language. From my own experience, the best way to do so is to use examples. So let's see how this would look like in practice. Imagine that you have to explain the concept of, for example, neural network to a person that doesn't know anything about that, but for some reason has to understand it at some basic level to make a decision. Just a quick parenthesis, this is actually something that happens very often in companies. The decision makers don't have the necessary technical knowledge, so they often depend heavily on the ability of tech people to explain their stuff correctly and simply. But let's go back to our example. How could we make neural networks relatable to anyone? Well, the easiest way would be through an example. One that I can think of right now is to compare neural networks to interconnected roads where information travels from one point to the other. So instead of saying neural networks, refer to them as interconnected roads. This comparison would likely sound much less intimidating to non-technical audience. Another very useful strategy is to use visuals to simplify complex ideas. More often than not, STEM professionals work with very complex data, and the level of complexity tends to increase quite quickly. And this can become very overwhelming very fast to a non-technical audience. What I found out works well in that case are visual representations such as diagrams or charts, since they can help illustrate abstract concepts in a more tangible way. So let's see how we can use the visual representations in that case. Imagine you're trying to explain the concept of global temperature trends to someone who isn't familiar with climate science. And of course, instead of bombarding them with complex data tables, you could show them a line graph representing the temperature fluctuations over time. By doing so, your audience can easily see if temperatures are rising or falling. This visual representation makes it clear and easy to understand without needing to decipher raw data. Another good tool is to use diagrams, schemes, and flowcharts to illustrate complex processes. It is very important to note that all of these tools should have a purpose, and the purpose is to make it simple for your audience, so try not to overdo it. A few simple charts can do wonders, but only if you really keep them that way, which is simple. And the third strategy that I found works really well is to try to tell a story. Incorporating storytelling techniques can be very effective in simplifying technical topics. Essentially, by framing the discussion within a narrative, you can engage your audience and provide some context for very complicated ideas. For example, when explaining machine learning algorithms, you could tell a story of how a self-driving car learns to navigate its environment, while also using some real-world examples to illustrate the key concept that you want to set as take-home messages. This approach is very useful since it humanizes the subject matter and makes it more relatable to diverse audiences. In summary, decoding technical jargon for non-technical audience requires a little bit of creativity, a lot of clarity, and even more empathy. By avoiding jargon, using comparisons and analogies, leveraging the use of visuals and incorporating storytelling techniques, we can make STEM concepts more understandable and more accessible to a wider audience, which is very often the entire point of many of our data presentations. I hope that you found these tips useful and that you will incorporate them in your next presentation. Thank you for listening, and until next time. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you are ready to elevate your communication skills and transform your data into valuable insights, schedule a free discovery call on the link in the description.